Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people designing the future of creative work and shaping our culture. I'm Bill, and this is Carl, and we are your hosts. Good morning, Carl.
Morning, Bill. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. I cannot complain on this beautiful day. How about yourself?
Great. Gonna be honest, I say this every week, and every week it's true. Super excited for this week's episode.
Yeah, well, I would say we've got a good start because we've got our friend Terrance hosting, who we are both big fans of, and he's just a fountain of knowledge in his own right, but he's also brought a friend of his on as today's guest for a bit of a different conversation than we've had so far.
Yeah, we are going to go deep into the world of science fiction with Dave Addey. So Dave Addey is the author of the blog and book Typeset in the Future. And a couple years ago, Dave, who is a big science fiction fan, started a blog where he just sort of would do screen grabs, typography of type that as it's used in these science fiction movies and in science fiction movies, and just sort of talk about it, analyze the type usage, talk about what it meant and what it signified and all this stuff. And the blog was a huge hit and was then subsequently published as a book. And what Dave noticed is that in science fiction movies, particularly of a certain vintage from like the 70s and early 80s and whatnot, one typeface kept showing up over and over again, and that typeface was Eurostile. One of those typefaces that everyone has seen, whether you realize it or not. It's sort of a squarish shaped typeface, and movie after movie after movie using Eurostile as a way to signify kind of a futurism, or futurist design. So Alien, Blade Runner, a number of others. And so he kind of went movie by movie looking at how it was used and just sort of exploring that usage. And then also found that this usage sort of established Eurostile as the go-to typeface for quote unquote the future in movie making. So it shows up, in these sci-fi classics, but then also in newer movies like WALL-E, Moon, and several others. So he and Terrance just go all out talking about it, and it's a really fun conversation.
We've done a lot of, I think, type nerd type things here, but I don't know that we've done many just straight up nerd out episodes. So I think the audience is really going to enjoy this one.
It's fun once you really start paying attention to this stuff, whether you are a designer yourself or a type designer or just someone who's interested. The more you pay attention to the letters around you, the more interesting it becomes. So yeah, really excited to share this, and I hope everyone enjoys it.
Awesome. With that, we could turn it over to our friend Terrance and to his guest Dave for today's episode of Creative Characters. Please enjoy, everybody.
All right, Mr. Dave Addey, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.
I want to talk to you about a great number of things today, but we'll try to keep it somewhat focused. Why I'm having you here today is just because of your work with your blog and your book called Typeset in the Future, the typography and design in science fiction movies, which I think is just one of the most fun books that I've owned in forever. But I want to give you the opportunity just to introduce yourself and how you came to this project.
Yeah, so really it came from watching a lot of sci-fi movies with a kind of design mind whilst watching them. And at some point, I just started spotting the same typefaces, and one in particular, time and time and time again. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. It was in every single movie I watched. The typeface in question is, of course, Eurostile Bold Extended, which if it doesn't immediately come to mind, the moment you look at it, you will think sci-fi. You will think of the future. And so this led to me digging deep into possibly the original example of this, which was 2001: A Space Odyssey. Wrote a design study of that, which was a lot of fun to research and a great opportunity to go deep on a movie I loved. Published it on the internet and to my surprise, other people actually found it interesting as well. So indeed, I think it took down my web server and led to about a $1,200 internet overage charge. So clearly I was doing something right. So this led to writing a few more of these studies, Alien, Moon, and Blade Runner. And that actually led to Matt Zonner Seitz, who's a TV critic, getting in touch and saying, "This is great. You should speak to my editor at Abrams. He's written a bunch of amazing design books for Abrams." And that in turn led to the opportunity to go even deeper and spend another couple of years writing about even more movies. And I think perhaps not just going on the fact that Eurostile is in every movie, but actually starting to dig into why are there certain design choices and typography choices that are made for sci-fi and for futurism. And so, yeah, that gave me the chance to really dig deep into that.
Why were you inspired to write the first blog post? And then how long was it between writing all of these blog posts and then compiling them into a book?
I mean, each of them took several months to research and write, because 98% of the time was actually digging into things and screenshotting things and looking at the thing in the background and then doing an awful lot of Googling or research. And so I think it was probably a good kind of year and a half, 2 years to write those initial blogs. And then it was another 2 years to actually take that, expand it, and write 3 more studies, 3 more movies, plus a whole bunch of interviews and extra bits around the edge before it finally became a book. So it took a while, but it was a very good opportunity to actually, well, firstly, to watch a bunch of sci-fi movies I loved again. Yeah. Always happy to have an excuse to do that, but also a chance to speak to a few folks who they've actually been doing this as a living, designing these things as a living for many years. So I got to speak to Mike Okada, who's the scenic art supervisor for many, many Star Trek iterations, and spoke to a couple of type experts, Stephen Coles from Letterform Archive and Antonio Cavadoni, who's a type designer and kind of expert on the designer of Eurostyle. And also got to speak to Paul Verhoeven, director of some of my favorite sci-fi movies, RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers.
See, I got this problem. Cops don't like me, so I don't like cops.
And also a couple of the folks behind WALL-E as well. So, yeah, really great chance for me to get their expertise and insight and the tricks they've learned over time as to how they use design and typography to evoke the future.
And I love how these extra interviews are sprinkled in through the book, and the book as a whole has a really nice feel to it. This feels like a dream job to me. Is it a dream job for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd been kind of watching these movies with a design eye for a long while, I think, but hadn't actually realized there was a way I could do something more with that, and that, I could kind of share it with other people, I guess. And so taking the time to give myself the excuse to do the research, but also find a medium to share it was really fun. It's just finding a thing that you're passionate about. It's finding a thing that you are interested enough in that you will spend 3 hours looking at a single screenshot of Blade Runner, trying to find out what the text reads, or figuring out which letter set sheet was used for a particular thing in Star Trek The Motion Picture. All of these just like innatives that actually are kind of interesting, because then it leads you down a rabbit hole of, wait, that thing on the screen is actually some surplus letter set they clearly had left, and they've used it as a little design trick. All of these rabbit holes of design fun.
And it doesn't feel like work then at that point. It's not a chore. Yeah. Especially when I'm reading through this, I'm kind of imagining myself, being on set and kind of making some of those decisions. And how would you make this prop quickly and accurately and have a level of quality, but also, like you point out, being comfortable with things that will be invisible to the camera. And it comes up multiple times in the book, in these movie reviews, where there will be kind of dummy text, lorem ipsum kind of occurrences where the prop designers, they know that it's not going to get a close up, but it needs to look believable at a quick glance, and maybe it'll get 2 seconds of screen time. But those 2 seconds can be so valuable in setting the tone for the movie.
Yeah, this was something I came to realize from actually looking at not just watching the movies, but studying them frame by frame and actually seeing the tricks that production designers and scenic art designers had used. And it made me realize there are really 2 purposes of typography in any movie, but particularly in sci-fi movies. One is you've got to communicate an important story point. You've actually, you want to say planet about to explode, I think was the example that Mike used. You really want something that's going to flash kind of bright, and the viewer cannot miss it. So they get that plot point is happening. And then the other is that you want to make things look scientific or important, or like there's a lot of activity happening and all the systems are running on the spacecraft. But you really don't want people to read it, because if they read it, it's going to distract them from what the actor is saying. And so that led me to take a look at, well, okay, what are the tricks that people use to make sure we don't read the text in many, many cases, like, writing it in a foreign language, writing it in an alien language, so that even people who speak that foreign language don't read it. And there are lots and lots of different tricks there, I think, that may not make for good usability or good design that we should apply in the real world, but do a great job of not distracting us while we're trying to watch.
That's really good. I remember watching movies like 2001 or Alien, maybe when I was in high school, and kind of, having a gut reaction like, these are good movies. I like this genre of movies. And when I was in college, I met a friend of mine who is a film editor, and he would play classic movies at his house and critique the movie as we're watching it, I think the same thing could be said about typefaces as well. The more you learn about typography and type design, the more you will appreciate the product that's made from it. So
yeah, I think some definite parallels between the purpose of design in movies and the purpose of design in typography. It has to communicate something clearly. It has to be, the design of the typography has to both succeed so you can actually read it, but also evoke the particular feeling you want. But it also has to be something that it does the job without necessarily getting in the way. But it's like, you shouldn't notice the music, you shouldn't notice the editing, you shouldn't notice the design, because they're so good at what they're doing that they're kind of taking you into the moment. They're not pulling you out of it. And I think that it's the same is true in type design as well. It's that fine balance between having something with a bit of character that has its own kind of personality, but that also gets the job done.
Have you ever been interested in making your own film? Like, could you art direct a film today if you wanted to?
I think the short answer is no. I would love the opportunity to try, but I think one of the things I've come to realize is that there is so much craft and I think so much design experience that goes into this. And also it's such a team effort to put together the design of one of these things, especially when you're world building. I'm thinking of the example of Blade Runner, where the art department designed so many things that ended up not being used in the movie at all. But because they designed them, they figured out what that world was, and they figured out the kind of they really fleshed out the world through the design of the objects they created. And so I think it really does take a bunch of people collaboratively figuring out a design vision for a world to create something that is as internally consistent and believable as a Blade Runner or an Alien or 2001.
I want to dive deeper into Eurostile, and I want to talk more about kind of the formal qualities of design and how Eurostile fits in that moment in time in history with this kind of, departure point, I suppose, of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and how the typeface kind of existed before that and after that. So the story starts in Italy with a young type designer named Aldo Novaris. It's 1952, and the type foundry he worked for called Nebbiolo, and his teacher, his collaborator at the time, Alessandro Butti, and they design a typeface called Microgramma. And it looks like Eurostile. It's very square with, rounded sides, a super ellipse, as they call it. But this Microgramma typeface was only released in capital letters. 10 years later, this designer, Aldo Novaris, in 1962, expanded that design idea into what they called Eurostile. They designed a lowercase for it and added more styles, a condensed, that sort of thing. And I think about this sequel similar to how, a design like Neue Haus Grotesk became Helvetica. And Helvetica was kind of the sequel, which was, rehashed. And then one more part along this journey is Linotype in the 80s digitized it and became the Eurostile LT kind of digital version that we would, most likely be familiar with. Then, as the final movie, the third movie, is Eurostile Next, which was really a remastering in 2008 at Linotype, this time with my colleague Kira Kobayashi, and again, expanded the typeface and remastered it for better curve quality and stroke contrast and some of those things that were lost along the way of converting it from metal to photo and to digital later. So, we often, describe it as kind of like remastering a music album that might have been recorded in the 70s or something. And is there anything you want to add to that timeline there?
Yeah, no, I mean, great timeline.
Okay.
I think that the one thing I would add, and I only add this because it was a complete surprise to me. This was something I learned from Antonio Capadoni, was that I'm so used to seeing microgramma and Eurostile big.
Yes.
Used as the down the entire side of a spaceship big.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that really surprised me was to learn that actually they were designed originally with the exact opposite use case in mind. Antonio's Italian taught me that, microgramma is literally small. It's designed to be used at very, very small sizes. And in fact, Nebbiolo kind of to prove it would work well at small sizes, they actually engraved the entire Hail Mary prayer onto a single piece of metal type, incredibly small. And it worked. It could hold those shapes and it could hold the ink. And a lot of this, I think, came from the fact that those kind of rounded, squared off circle shapes, actually, they felt were very, very effective at holding those small sizes. The funny thing to me is that Eurostile and also Bank Gothic, which is kind of the other classic sci-fi typeface, many similar characteristics, was also designed for use at very, very small sizes and has these kind of, angled edges that were designed to keep the shape even when very small. And now we use them at the other extreme. We put them on IMAX movie screens. We put them down the side of spaceships. And Antonio's, I think, take on this was because they were designed to work as small as they were, they actually have quite a lot of character to them. They have some quite extreme shapes to help them hold their shape. And that's what makes them so interesting as titling when we blow them up to the other extreme. They have really unusual, interesting shapes to them. And so, it was funny to me that they'd gone from one extreme to the other.
And formally, too, is that because the overall shapes are so square, you can space them very tightly, as opposed to maybe if you're looking at Futura, where you're having circles, triangles, and squares. Even if you smash them as tight as you can, you're still going to have big kind of white spaces in between those letters, and it kind of makes for an irregular rhythm.
Yeah, and another thing I learned from Antonio about Aldo, who designed these, was that he was a big advocate for creating typefaces that helped designers in their day-to-day life, not just because they were good typefaces, but because they were very flexible and adaptable. And Eurostile is a great example of this. Stop, another of his great designs, is an example of this, where because they follow their modularity very well, you can smash letters together very easily. You can create a logotype basically just by kind of continuing two lines together. And that was apparently very deliberate in the designs that he created, was to make it so these things could be smashed together and become more than just individual characters very easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best type designers have experience designing stuff in the real world, books or logos or whatever, that can really give someone just the insight that they need in order to make good typefaces that are not necessarily like art, but super usable stuff that's targeted at that, like Stop, for example, which is, it kind of essentially became like a logo kit, right?
Absolutely.
The typeface is so modular and kind of stenciled in that way that you can tear it apart and put it back together and make a unique word mark from it without any trouble.
You're right. It is literally a kit for smooshing these things together. It became so easy to do so that it almost became a cliche that, when you saw it, this has been done so effectively so many times that it was like, well, we didn't really take the time to design something. We smooshed this together, it's a shame because it's a sign that it was successful. It also was one, I think both Eurostile and Stop were one of the kind of the earlier Letraset typefaces that were available in dry sheet lettering, which just made that even more possible because it made it possible to, physically combine these things and just scratch out just the bits that you wanted to make the logotype you needed. I'm sure that can only have helped their usage and popularity for creating those kind of designs.
I love that overlap of technology with the Letraset and with the 2001 in particular, just how you described it, how you could take a sheet of Letraset and smash it onto any object that you had on set. I feel like that would be done digitally today, right? There's something so rich about the analog designed worlds with 2001 and things like Alien as well, that they're just, the set is amazing. And when especially once you realize it's all handmade stuff and someone wired in 1,000 blinking lights into this thing for 2 seconds of screen time, and it feels so much more satisfying to see than something that is recreated digitally, I think.
Yeah, it's always the case that whatever the readily available technology and typography of the time might happen to be, there's a natural tendency to reach for it and use it because it's so easily applicable. I mean, in the case of Letraset, literally applicable to any prop or piece of scenery that you might have to hand. There's a lot of red Helvetica in Blade Runner and Alien, which makes me wonder if perhaps there was a designer who worked on both Ridley Scott movies who had a real love for the way that could evoke it, but also just it was so easy to apply to a prop.
Yeah, or it's just like I know the boss is gonna like this, so I won't have to do it twice. This will get approved right away. And just do this. Eurostile was intended to be this design of the time in 1962. And looking at the formal relationships between this typeface with the rounded corners and how those similar shapes occurred in specifically industrial design in the mid-century there, with the edge of TV screens like CRT monitors and train windows like you point out to, and furniture designs from like Charles and Ray Eames. They all have these rounded corners. I think it was, zeitgeist, I suppose. And also we have to remember, too, is that the Apollo missions and the space race was going on at the same time. People read about space travel in the news every day. It was the hot topic. And one part in the book, too, that I love is when you show some of the spacesuit Apollo badges or like patches, right? The embroidered patch on the shoulder. And what typeface is it? It's Eurostile. It's like, it's right there. So,
yeah, and it's funny that we think of it of the typeface as the typeface of the future when it was very much designed to be of the now, exactly as you say. I actually tracked down one of the earlier samplers of it at the Letterform archive. And the text on the front describes it as a modern family of characters which expresses and synthesizes with its design the dynamism of our century. It was very much of its time.
Yeah.
And but because, I think particularly because it was used so strikingly in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was also of that time, and because that became, that kind of changed how sci-fi movies were designed, because it brought that realism to it that we just hadn't necessarily had very much before. I think because of that, such a strong use case, it then picked up this other association that if you wanted to evoke that same feeling, you would choose that same typeface, even though it wasn't originally designed to evoke the future. And it's the kind of thing that once that begins and once a few movies then follow it, and I should give credit actually to Star Trek here as well. The original series used Eurostile Bold, not extended, but Eurostile Bold in its credits. So it was technically kind of the first big sci-fi example of using Eurostile. But I think the extended version in Eurostile Bold Extended became the canonical one through 2001. But once it's used and then maybe reinforced by a few people following it because they want that, I get something for free by using that same same thing. They evoke the same. It becomes this self-perpetuating thing to the point where now it's the default, or another typeface that has those same qualities, so you get the same feel. And yeah, now it's the default for pretty much every sci-fi movie made.
I'm a car fan as well. And one thing that comes to mind is like speedometers of a Mustang or a Porsche in the 80s or 90s were still using Eurostile. And maybe they were using it because this kind of rounded square harmonizes with the design of the rest of the car. There's a lot of rounded straight lines and stuff in automotive work. Even modern day, you look at something like Chevy has a typeface that looks a lot like it too, kind of in the same genre. Maybe they were using that as saying like, this car is high tech. Look at how high tech this car is because I'm using this kind of, this sci-fi industrial machined looking typeface for the speedometer.
I totally agree about the form being the thing that naturally lends itself to going across the back of a truck or, the kind of the radiator decal on the front of a car. It looks as good on the side of a car as it does on the side of a spaceship, purely because of the shape of the thing that it's decorating or naming, which I guess doesn't make quite so much sense for a speedometer in a way, because, you've got a very compact space. It almost becomes like glorified tick marks around the edge at that point.
Yeah.
But because it follows that same design that's maybe used elsewhere on the vehicle, it feels like part of a whole.
Yeah, and maybe it's just a play off of the geometry that's not pure circles and stuff too, or Futura. Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting too because at Monotype a few years ago we did this legibility study with the MIT Age Lab, I believe it was, and we did this study comparing glance times inside of a car interface, and we compared Frutiger Humanist sans serif with Eurostile as like an exemplar of a very square sans serif. The study came back, I'm paraphrasing, but we can look it up or link to it or whatever. But I'm paraphrasing in that the humanist typeface, like Frutiger, was able to be read faster than the square Eurostile. So essentially, the study kind of proved like this is the wrong typeface to use for an actual interface that would be read, kind of in depth. So it's interesting that these movies were, maybe using this style of typeface as this is what a futuristic interface would look like. And then, the actual reality is that it's not so great.
I guess this comes back to the thing we talked about earlier about sometimes you actually don't want the thing to be read. Maybe that's proven that some of those design choices were good. And even in 2001, most of the use cases of Eurostile Bold Extended for the HAL 9000 screens, where it's kind of three characters that evoke, like the kind of the NASA language referring to different parts of the spaceship at the time. So they are there very much as evocative design elements rather than text to be focused on and read. And if it turns out that actually it isn't as innately readable as maybe some of the more humanist typefaces might be, then I'd say that's probably a good choice because it isn't meant to distract you, which is such an important part.
And yeah, comparing like Alien and 2001, just for an example, I know Alien is kind of based on, there's this evil corporation that exists, the Weyland thing, and that's part of the story. But I think what's really interesting from 2001 also, as from a designer's point of view, is that their use of branding and like real world branding. Like in the movie, it's the Pan Am is the shuttle that takes him up to the space station, and Howard Johnson and like Hilton, I think, is in the space station. And so this use of contemporary brands at the time, I think that use of relatable brands makes the story more accessible and believable at the time too. It's almost more frightening because it is that much closer to your reality as an audience member.
Absolutely. And that extrapolation from the future, I think, is such a strong sci-fi design trope, even in the days of Twilight Zone, all the way through to Blade Runner does this. There are plenty of real world brands in there extrapolated to how they might be in the future. Like 2001 is a particularly interesting example of this because they actually worked with, I think, like over 40 different companies of the time and basically went to them and said, give us your prototypes. We want to see what you imagine the future is going to be like. And many of those prototypes actually end up being in the movie. There's, prototype GM car that they show in there. Prototype Whirlpool space kitchen, because Whirlpool had worked with NASA on these kind of things, but they had this the way they might imagined it would be. So the designers there actually got a lot for free by working with those brands, as well as the brands getting great publicity. And it led to good publicity for the movie. Everyone was a winner. Possibly the exception to this, and I think it's interesting for being an exception, is actually Alien. Alien is, I think, the one where it doesn't feature any present day brands in a future context. It goes the other way. Mm-hmm. It uses the Weyland-Yutani corporate branding exclusively. Everything in that spacecraft has that logo on it, that kind of winged Weyland-Yutani logo. And so you get this sense of them being owned by the company and kind of being, they don't have their own license in what they're doing. And that certainly proves true in the movie. But it's a very deliberate choice, I think, to give that feeling of control.
The third kind of section I wanted to talk about was, I have it listed as future, how we see the future of design. So let's talk about the future. One thing that's really interesting with sci-fi, I guess, is that it's a record of our predictions. And it reveals hopes and fears of everyone. And I feel like in 2021, we have renewed hopes and fears for a lot of things that are, really happening in our world, the pandemic, climate change, and also hopes for space travel or vaccine technology. If we're looking past this kind of mid-century or like sci-fi movies from the 60s and 70s, and you mentioned Minority Report, like how do contemporary sci-fi movies fit with hopes and fears and interfaces? Yeah.
There's a long history of sci-fi extrapolating from the paranoias of the now and the opportunities of the now as well. Like, there are Star Trek: The Motion Picture and Alien, at least in its director's edition, both had kind of futuristic body scanning technology that was very much an extrapolation from CRT scans, which were still relatively new at the time. Blade Runner 2049 has extensive use of drones as an assistance to the lead character, which is very much of this time. And so I think any sci-fi we watch, this includes present day, takes those kind of cool new things that we're a little afraid of. There was a glut of AI movies a few years ago, Her being a great example, which is a similar kind of thing. And we have, I think, Black Mirror being an excellent modern day Twilight Zone doing the same kind of thing. Taking all of the technologies and the opportunities and paranoias and extrapolating the what if. So I think that's almost a big part of science fiction's inspiration is to take those things and take us on that what if. One opportunity it gives, and Twilight Zone I think is the classic example of this, is it's a chance to tell those stories in a way that maybe we're a little more willing to go along with, because it isn't taking our real world and imagine that. It's kind of putting them in this slightly fantastical setting that makes us a little more comfortable to go along for the ride. And in the case of Twilight Zone, actually get around censorship that if you did it in a fantastical world, you could tell that story on TV. Maybe you couldn't.
Yeah.
So that I am sure will continue to be the case. Where I think we maybe need to be, as designers, we need to be a little wary, is the designs that we see in sci-fi movies, which can feel awesome and inspirational, are not necessarily always great real-world designs. The most recent trend I've seen of this in sci-fi is the idea of the see-through, transparent screen. So Minority Report, I think, was a big instigator of this.
I was thinking maybe I'd play hooky, stay home today.
Right, meeting.
Working too much.
But it's in a whole bunch of recent movies where your computer screen is now a glass sheet and it has things overlaid on top of it. And it looks awesome. We're not quite there technologically, but we could imagine how we might get there. The problem is, actually, it turns out if you've got a transparent screen, it's actually kind of hard to read the text. That's a really challenge for type to stand out in that, because you can see the background through it and it is distracting. But what it does give is a great way to film your protagonists using that UI, usually looking through the screen so the text is reversed and it doesn't distract us. Yet another trick for avoiding that. And we focus on the face and we focus on the person, but we still have this sense that stuff is going on. So I think that's yet another example of It's become a trope. It's now a thing we do.
Yeah, and to describe this scene that we're talking about where Tom Cruise is using this computer screen that is like the size of a big screen TV, but it's like 2 feet in front of him.
Time horizon 12 minutes.
All right, what he's doing now we call scrubbing the image, looking for clues as to where the murder is going to happen.
Original running bond brick pattern, streamline early Georgian details. Brick has been repointed. Look at this kid. And this one he's on the left side of the man in the suit.
Yes? So?
This one he's on the right.
And he has his arms completely outstretched and is touching and is interacting with images and stuff on the screen, but it would be exhausting. Like waving your arms around for more than a few minutes at a time. It's like an ergonomic nightmare.
But it's a great storytelling device.
But it's beautiful.
Because he can focus in on different things and we can see him all the time he's doing it. And
yes.
Yeah. So it's as designers, we kind of always have to keep in mind, not just how might I make this a reality and would this be super cool, but also actually, is it that useful? And I think it's a testament to the production design of these movies that we kind of don't, even as designers, we don't necessarily trigger that, wait a minute. This isn't something that would work because we're so involved in it and so invested in it that we believe it could be possible.
Yeah. And there's another example this reminds me of in the movie Moon, which you go into detail about. In this story, there is this like assistant robot, and the robot only interacts with the actor using emoji.
Gertie, have you heard anything new about anyone fixing lunar sat?
No, Sam. What I understand is it's fairly low on the company's priority list right now.
Tell him to sort that out. You know what I'm talking about? That's not... I've only got 2 weeks, but it's not fair to whoever's coming up here next.
I will, Sam. Do you want me to finish cutting your hair later?
Nah, come on, let's finish this.
And there are like 4 different emoji yellow smiley faces. And when the movie first came out, I think emojis were newer at the time. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cute. But when I see it now, I'm like, whoa, that's really accurate kind of prediction.
Yeah, the Gertie is the name of the robot in that one. It's voiced by Kevin Spacey. It does have a very emotionless voice in the long tradition of spaceship computers all the way back to 2001, where they're very monotone and emotionless.
Yes.
And I think that's why the emoji are actually such an amazing design choice, because it almost plays into that same, it's this sort of fake expression of emotion. It's this sort of, just trying to add some emotion to this thing that doesn't have it. I don't want to spoil the movie, but actually it turns out that Gertie has a much more active role than just being there as an emotionless assistant.
Yeah, and I think it adds to the suspense. Is this computer going to harm me or not?
Absolutely. I am sure that the vocal choice and the design choice is very much playing on our learned behavior of the evil space-based computer, which begins with HAL 9000, but we have other examples of it since. The same approach is used in WALL-E. The autopilot there is very much riffing on that same principle.
Sir, I insist you give me the plan.
Otto, get out of my way.
We cannot go home.
What are you talking about? Why not?
That is classified. Captain, give me the plan.
What do you mean classified? You don't keep secrets from the captain.
Give me the plan.
Tell me what's classified.
The plan.
Tell me, Otto. That's an order.
And with WALL-E, the autopilot has a big round red light, which is exactly what HAL 9000 was depicted at in 2001.
Yeah, the glowing red eye. I mean, that's become a trope in itself. Again, I think starting with the lens of 2001 of HAL, but, Terminator has the same thing. The Matrix has the same thing, where that kind of glowing red, just the wires in our head go, yeah, this is bad.
And we use these same shortcuts with typefaces. I mean, outside of sci-fi too. I mean, you can, Greek yogurt, for example. Maybe it has a Chobani, rounded typeface. It's creamy right away without needing any further information. Or you might use like a wedge serif or something that's spicy. It looks spicy right away. We know. If you use them, delicately and purposefully, you can get a lot for free visually. And conveying those ideas with a typeface. That's just how type works.
Now, although I think this is another long-standing one, is continuing to cut bits out of the typeface to make it even less humanist, to take it as far away as possible from the human hand.
Yeah.
So starting with something that's already geometric and then slicing bits out until you can only just just about figure out what it's saying. Again, it's a trope. It's something that's been used before, but it works very effectively. It makes it feel even more alien.
Yeah. In your book, there's like a set of steps. Maybe it's 10 or 12 steps. It's
yeah, the rules for making text futuristic.
Yeah, and it's in there. It's like, use this typeface as a base, and maybe we'll add stenciling or slanting it, and then there's this set of rules of how cliche can you make it. Yeah.
Every one example is kind of trying to, or I maybe not deliberately trying, but effectively taking it away from our comfort zone of, basically handwriting as kind of our default position of what type it originated from. Maybe the best example of this being used for storytelling, or at least dramatic effects, is the opening credits to Alien. Yeah. And they actually do it the other way around. We start with just these kind of floating pieces of just solid blocks. We don't know what they mean. We don't know what they're there for. And over time, we start to realize that they're forming the word alien. But it's done with such great pacing and with such slow revealing that it puts you on edge even before the movie started. I think that's such a good use of type to kind of put us off balance.
My favorite part of that intro, besides that small typographic thing, is that they continue that mood through the first couple of shots. They basically just show you the whole set in its like empty, dark, cold state. And if you just look at that as a piece by itself, it's just like, this set is a masterpiece.
We have, I think, a long lingering shot of an emergency helmet, which has emergency helmet very clearly stenciled on the front in Helvetica. I do feel as though we've almost reached a point where these Eurostile Bold Extended and similar, Bank Gothic and others, they have just about got to the point where they're almost becoming the kind of the typeface of future past rather than something that is necessarily evoking the future. There's a good example it was one of the Star Trek movies, Star Trek Beyond, I think, where they discover an old craft. And it has a plate that has the ship's name in Eurostile Bolt Extended, but it's meant to be, the previous future ship.
Scotty, can you get this thing started?
What, started? Yes. Flying, sir? That's a different thing. These old vessels, they were built in space. They were never supposed to take off from atmosphere.
Make it happen.
They're called starships for a reason, Captain.
And I wonder if we've got to the point where actually it's time for movies to, they can give themselves more of an identity by not making those choices. Even if they don't get things for free, they can give themselves more of their own kind of imagining of the future. We even have things like Arrival, where the whole point of the movie is it's about an alien typeface, or alien language, I guess, discovering that. And, they have some amazing design to evoke that goes way beyond anything that we would use as a stereotypical trope. But it gives it all that more visual identity because of it, because they've imagined something new.
If I remember, the alien creatures are using smoky and kind of swirly repeating patterns, and the stories about them trying to crack the code.
Yeah, their language is very much kind of based around time and circles, and almost the kind of design metaphor I think they went for was like the coffee stain design. So that any sentence that they write is a circle with details around the circle, but it doesn't really have a beginning and an end. So the circular design is deliberate, and so that gave them, I think, a great opportunity to create the very, very distinct design language that is so far removed from typography that we don't almost think of it in that way. We think of it as it's completely its own thing, and a great piece of design for it. It also gives the filmmakers an opportunity to translate that back into English with us. In that case, I think they used Futura, and so they can still kind of make their own design choice for the translation. But it means that the design is so inherently alien that we couldn't even try and read it. It's just not even something we can comprehend, and that's kind of the point of the movie.
It reminds me of like data visualization charts and almost like a scientific way of capturing a lot of data. But like you said, with this kind of naturalistic twist on it, like how would a creature create this as opposed to something that is machined or fabricated mathematically? But in the same way that our written languages is a sort of data visualization in that, the semantics, it's coded in there. It's our own code, except we're using rectangles and lines. What if it's a circle? It reminds me of one other thing. I was at the Game Developers Conference in California. It was 2013 maybe. And I listened to this lecture from a concept artist. His advice was, you don't have to reinvent the world because you'll go down into a deep hole and no one will know what you're talking about. He said, take existing ideas and combine them in new ways and remix it. And the example he gave was pyramids in the snow. Everyone knows how pyramids work or what they represent, and people know what snow is. They're just two simple existing ideas, but represented in a new way in a story. Start there. And I thought that was brilliant advice.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the tools I came across while researching the book that can really help with that kind of random mashup opportunity, to kind of help you prompt the brain, was a tool called The Thing from the Future. This was created by Stuart Candy and Jeff Watson from Situation Lab. And it's a deck of cards. There are 3 types of cards. There's a prompt, a thing, and a theme. So the example I have here is like, in a noir future, so that's the environment, there is an app, that's the thing, related to justice. That's the kind of the theme.
Yep.
And the question prompt then is, what is it? And the nice thing about this is you can mix up those 3 different prompts to make millions of permutations of things, but they give you that trigger to kind of make you think, oh yeah, okay. And they're all things that we're familiar with, and that's kind of the point. But mashing them up in those new interesting ways is a prompt to imagine something we might not otherwise. Yeah, there was that. I think you can even download them. I think they released them as a download from situationlab.org, and I just thought it was a really, really cool tool to help jog the brain a little bit, to not fall into the same patterns and to imagine new combinations.
That's brilliant. Have you seen, there's a tool, a URL called Type Cooker, and type designers use this. And so it'll give you a prompt. It'll say wedge serif for low stroke contrast for a newspaper or whatever. And it'll give you these random parameters, and you have to design a typeface for that. And so they use it as a teaching tool at Type Cooper West, I think, and it's excellent.
Extrapolation is definitely the recurring theme here. It's, take things we know, mash them up in interesting new ways, and it will usually lead to an interesting creation.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, it turns out other people might actually find it interesting too.
That's right.
Which, to my surprise and delight, it turns out people who are really, really interested in design and people who are really, really interested in sci-fi actually has a surprising overlap.
Yeah.
It turns out there's a lot of commonality between the two. And I'm sure it is that imagining the what if is the common theme between them.
What I admire about you and this project is just kind of following your joy and asking yourself why do I love this thing, and dig into it, get into it.
Well, if I can give people an excuse to rewatch their favorite movies, that is all good by me.
Dave, thank you so much for joining me. Hope to bump into you at a TypeCon again in the future, maybe.
Definitely. And thank you again for the chance to talk about it. Always happy to wax lyrical about Eurostile.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about Dave and the work he's doing, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, or visit his website at typesetinthefuture.com. You can also visit monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. And if you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Christopher Sound, and Marie Tabarez. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.